Well, welcome back. We've still got the dado stack installed from yesterday, so we're ready to start cutting those stopped dados in the pedestal leg assemblies. So let's get going. What I'm doing right now is just chalking in the approximate location of the dados that'll be cut into the pedestal legs to take these panels. Sure wouldn't want to cut the dados in the wrong location after all this work. Now the dados are going to be stopped dados. They need to start at the top and come down the same 17 3/4 inch as this panel, so the panels will sit in the dados sort of like that. And cutting a stopped dado on the table saw is going to present a little bit of a challenge for one reason. Let me show you why that is. Alright, I've got a scrap of plywood here and I've been making some test cuts in it, but I'm going to push this in over this dado stack about halfway and then stop the saw so we can see what the stopped dado is going to look like. And what you'll be able to see here is the issue. We've got a full depth dado here, but then as we get close to the curvature of the blade, the dado depth starts to decrease until finally it's level with the surface. So when we go to put a piece of wood in, what's going to happen is we're either going to have an exposed area here, or we've got two ways to fix this. We can take a chisel and square this out and get this down to the level of the rest of the dado, or we could notch the plywood so that it overlaps that curved area. And I've got to decide which one's going to really be the best. Okay, I've got this scrap where we cut the test stopped dado mounted to the bench, and I've put in a sample of plywood, and I did measure back, and it's actually just a smidge shy of 1 3/8 inches. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make a mark at 1 3/8 inches on both sides, so I'll sort of know where to stop in the leveling process. The edges, of course, are marked out already by the Dado set, but I'm going to deepen these edges and then I'm going to cut along this, just pretty much like chopping out a dovetail. Okay, that looks pretty good. Let's try the other technique now. Okay, the other technique would be to cut a notch out here that would go over the tapered part of the dado. So I'm going to use the notch itself to set the depth on this marking knife. And let's see, we've set 1 inch and 5/8 back, so we'll start right about there. Okay, and let's make a better mark there. And let's saw that out and see how that looks. Okay, I think either way would work, and work just fine. I think I'll go have a cup of coffee and think about which way I want to do it. Alright, so what I've done here to achieve the stopped dado is I first put my square in and flushed it up to the edge of the nut that holds the dado stack on. And then I marked the other edge of that nut. Now it's a 27 millimeter span across that nut, which is just a little over an inch, inch and a 1/16 approximately. So I found the center of that and marked center line. And this ostensibly is the center line of the Dado set. And we know as the Dado set passes top dead center and starts down, we get the curvature in the stopped dado, and we know that ends at 1 3/8 inch past the center. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come out here and I'm going to mark 1 3/8 inches. And that is where I want to stop cutting. That's where I want to put my 17 3/4 inch mark on the leg assembly. So I'll push the leg assembly through until the marks match up, and that should give me the taper ending at exactly 17 3/4 inches. Okay, I've made my stop mark here on the fence, and I've made a mark here at 17 3/4 inches from the end on this scrap piece of plywood. And what I'll do is I'll slide this through, cutting the dado until those two lines match up, and then I'll stop. And we'll see if this test everything is in the right place. Now I have gone ahead and set this 3/4 of an inch back, and I used a piece of 3/4 inch wood to set that with. It should be pretty close, but I can also adjust that after the fact. So let's make a test cut. Okay, so best laid plans. Made this mark here, got that worked out, and that was fine, except I realized that when I put the pedestal leg assemblies up here, they're taller than the fence. So I have used blue painter's tape and just extended this mark around the top up here. I even put the word stop with a little arrow, meaning that edge is where I've got to stop. I put the same thing over here on the other side because some of the dados are going to be cut 3/4 of an inch from the edge of the leg assembly on this side, and some will be set. I'll need to move the fence over to the other side and reset it up for 3/4 of an inch from the dado stack over there. So I'll be working off both faces, and I just used my combination square to confirm that those were equal, and I think we're set. Okay, our first dado looks pretty good. Okay, so now I've moved the fence over to the left side of the dado stack, and I'm making a couple of test cuts. And the first thing I want to do is make sure that I get the distance and I'm from the fence exactly the same as the other, and I'm just 2 cuts and I'm lucked out. I'm dead on. And the reason is, that may sound a little meticulous, but if there was any discrepancy between the distances from the edges, I would lessen my opportunity to make this assembly square. Now I'm going to cut to my mark and make sure that my length setup is still the same. It should be, but you know, 2 test cuts and then a real cut, it's probably safer. It's exactly the same. Okay, now we're ready to cut the rest of the dados. I could hear when I hit that void. Okay. All right, now to clean up the little slivers of wood that are left behind by the Dado set, it's really fun to use the router plane. It does a great job of just skimming along the surface and taking out those little tiny slivers of wood that are left behind. The other nice thing about a router plane is that the geometry of the blade is such that the blade is absolutely square to the edges, so you can get right into the corner of your dados and not have to worry about leaving a rounded corner there. Now I like to pull the router plane towards me most of the time. Some people like to push it, but I like to pull it because I can see the work better. Well, after much deliberation, consternation, procrastination, vacillation, some speculation, and a couple of double espressos, I flipped a coin and decided to notch the panels instead of squaring up the ends of the dados. At the end of the day, I'm not sure it makes a practical difference one way or the other. Both methods work, and I like using my Lee Nelson dovetail saw. I'm using my 6-inch combination square set at 1 3/8 inches to mark the end of the notch. And then I'm using my, I call it my dovetail marker, set at 1/4 inch to mark the cut line. And I want to stay just inside of that line so we get a nice tight fit. So all we got to do now is just saw out a few notches. Because of the nature of the construction, the glue up is actually quite simple. We can glue up one panel assembly at a time. Now I'm starting with the front or drawer side assembly, which is the face frame and the two 4-inch square legs. All we got to do is glue it up, and the only things we really want to be very careful about is to make sure that the two legs are perfectly flush at the top of the face frame and that the two legs are parallel and equidistant top and bottom from one another. The clamps will assure that. Just let that dry for a while, and we'll work on the other panel. The base assembly is all glued up and set to go. It looks pretty good. It's nice and strong, and I checked the square and it's right on being square. So I'm getting pretty excited because we're getting close to the time where we're actually going to be able to put this outfeed table to use. Now I figured since I had it upside down up here on my workbench, now's as good a time as any to install the casters. I'm going to get that done, and then I'll get somebody to help me lift this down and turn it over onto the floor. And we've got a few more things we've got to get done. Of course, we've got to install that trim we made for around the perimeter of the top assembly. We also got to make drawers and shelves over here, and we got to remember to put our miter slot extension slots into the top. But most importantly, what we need to do next is we need to engineer the system that's going to allow us to level the torsion box top assembly independent of the base. And that'll be what we get started on next in part 5. So be on the lookout for that video. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching this one.